There are people who live their entire lives never truly being seen. Not really. The world might watch them, follow them, argue about them, but seeing someone truly seeing them is something different altogether. It requires a kind of closeness that cameras and comment sections can never give you. It requires being there when the lights go off and the performance ends, and what's left is just a person, quiet and unguarded, trying to hold themselves together. Jordan Peterson has been watched by millions, studied, debated, praised, torn apart. His voice has reached corners of the world he will never visit. His words have been printed, screenshotted, quoted in arguments by strangers who have never met him. And yet, for all of that watching, for all of that noise, there is a strong case to be made that very few people have ever truly seen him. Until now. At 63, after surviving things that would have quietly ended most people, his daughter Michaela stepped forward and said something. Not to start a debate, not to defend him or attack him. She said something honest, something personal, something that cut through years of culture war noise and landed in a completely different place. It wasn't a headline in the traditional sense. It didn't come with a scandal attached, or leaked documents, or an agenda hiding underneath it. What it came with was something rarer. It came with the kind of truth that only someone who has sat beside a person in their darkest hours is ever really qualified to speak. The question people are asking isn't just what she said. The deeper question, the one that keeps pulling people back, is what it reveals about a man the world has spent years deciding it already knows. And whether any of those decisions were ever really true at all. To understand the weight of what Michaela said, you have to go back, not to the lectures or the controversy or the bestseller lists. You have to go back to before all of that, to the version of this story that didn't happen on stage. Because there is a Jordan Peterson that most people never encountered. Not the figure in the sharp suit, not the professor with the clipped answers and the unflinching eye contact. The version that matters here is the one that sat beside a hospital bed. The one that watched his wife Tammy, the woman he had loved since they were teenagers, face a cancer diagnosis that no amount of intelligence or discipline could reason away. That version of him is where this story really begins. In 2019, the world noticed Peterson disappearing. He had been everywhere for what felt like years, lectures filling theaters. Books selling in numbers that publishers don't usually see from academic authors. YouTube videos with view counts that rivaled musicians and comedians. And beneath all of it, a vast, quiet audience of people, mostly young, mostly men, who felt like someone had finally bothered to speak to them directly. Then the silence came. His wife's illness had begun reshaping everything around him in ways that didn't show up on stage. The fear that lives in the body when someone you love is suffering, it doesn't announce itself cleanly. It seeps in. It changes your sleep, your concentration, the way ordinary moments feel. Peterson, by his own account, began struggling in ways that caught him off guard. He had been prescribed benzodiazepines to help manage the anxiety that came with watching Tammy's illness. In the short term, that kind of medication can feel like relief. But dependency can form quietly, and the road out of it is one of the most physically and psychologically brutal roads a person can walk. His withdrawal became severe. The family sought treatment across countries, Russia, Serbia. There were reports, deeply unsettling ones, of a medically induced coma at one point. Through all of it, Michaela was there. Not as a spokesperson managing a public image, but as a daughter, frightened, exhausted, and present. She was the one who told the public her father was alive. She was the one who said he was fighting. In a moment when speculation was running in every direction, she was the voice that said simply, "He is still here." That matters enormously. Because it means that when Michaela talks about her father, she is not speaking from the outside looking in. She is speaking from having been in the room. And what she has recently chosen to share carries that weight with it, every word of it. There was a time before the storm found him when Jordan Peterson's life had a rhythm to it. Steady, purposeful, grounded in something that didn't require public validation to hold its shape. He had been at the University of Toronto for years, teaching clinical psychology, personality theory, the deep and often unsettling relationship between mythology and human meaning. His lectures were not dry. They were the kind of lectures that students recorded on their phones not for exam preparation, but because they wanted to listen again later, alone. When they had more time to sit with what had been said. His family was the axis everything else turned around. He and Tammy had known each other since childhood. There is something almost quietly extraordinary about that kind of history. Two people who chose each other before the world had finished shaping them. who grew into themselves alongside each other rather than apart. It's a kind of bond that resists easy description. Michaela grew up inside a childhood defined in large part by serious illness, juvenile arthritis, deep depression. A hip replacement before she had finished being a teenager. She faced at an age when most young people are still figuring out who they are, the kind of physical and emotional weight that leaves permanent marks. And her father was there for all of it. Not from a distance, present, watching her suffer and being unable to stop it. There is a passage in his book, and it surprised many readers who had come to see him as someone who always had control of his emotional register, where he writes about his daughter's illness not as a psychologist, not as a theorist, but as a father. Raw, unguarded, grieving, it revealed something that his public appearances rarely did. That underneath the precision and the arguments and the composure, there was a man who loved his family in a way that left him genuinely vulnerable. That shared history of hardship, father and daughter navigating pain together, built something between them that ordinary closeness doesn't quite capture. It was closeness forged in difficulty. The kind that holds differently and deeper than anything built in easier times. What none of them could have known was that the tests were far from finished. The acceleration of Peterson's public life when it came was genuinely disorienting in its speed. In 2016, he recorded a series of videos about a proposed piece of Canadian legislation regarding gender identity and compelled speech. It was an academic argument, carefully reasoned, made by a professor who had spent decades thinking about the relationship between language and power. But it landed in a cultural moment that was running at a temperature few people had anticipated, and it caught fire in ways that had very little to do with the original argument. Almost overnight, he became something else, not just a professor, a symbol, for some people a voice of courage and clarity in a confusing time. For others, a dangerous figure whose ideas needed to be stopped. Very few people in the middle seemed interested in treating him simply as a human being who had said something he believed and found himself standing in an unexpected storm. He kept going. That is perhaps the most revealing thing about him in that period. He kept teaching, kept speaking, kept writing, kept showing up. The book came, the tour came, the interviews multiplied. And through all of it, he maintained a kind of surface composure that from the outside looked like strength. But Michaela, who was watching from the inside, described something different. She described a man who was carrying things that weren't visible on stage. The weight of responsibility toward people who had attached enormous hope to his words. The fear circling his wife's diagnosis. The toll of living inside a storm that showed no sign of ending. And beneath it all, the medication and what it was quietly doing to his body. When the collapse came, it didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no single visible moment of breaking. It was more like a gradual dimming, a withdrawal from the public space. And then simply he was gone, into hospitals, into treatments that took the family far from home, into a period of recovery that no one around him knew the shape of yet. He came back. But not unchanged. By his own account and by Michaela's, what returned was a different version of him, not reduced but altered in some fundamental way. Stripped of defenses he had been carrying for so long he may not have noticed their weight until they were gone. Michaela Peterson is a complicated presence in conversations about her father, and that complication is worth paying attention to rather than flattening over. She has her own platform, her own audience, her own strongly held views on health and diet and how she has chosen to live her life. She has been open, at times strikingly so, about things that people in her position often choose to keep behind closed doors. Not because she is reckless with privacy, but because she seems to hold a genuine conviction that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is worth more than a carefully managed image. She spoke openly about her father's illness when it was happening. She described her fear during his treatment, the uncertainty of not knowing what recovery would look like, or whether it was even fully possible. She sat in the gap between what the public was speculating and what was actually true, and she chose to speak into it. But what she has spoken about more recently is something that goes deeper than medical updates. She described watching an emotional transformation in her father over the years since his recovery. Not just the visible recovery, the return of his energy and his voice and his presence in public life, but something less visible and perhaps more significant. A softening, she suggested, in how he relates to certain things. A growing capacity to stay with discomfort rather than immediately moving to resolve it. A willingness to feel things he might once have quickly converted into ideas or arguments. She spoke about grief surfacing during his recovery. About moments where the man who had spent years building frameworks for how other people should carry their suffering was, perhaps for the first time in a long time, simply carrying his own. Not analyzing it, not theorizing about it. Just sitting inside it quietly with nowhere else to go, that image is one that people responded to in a deep place. Because there is something that becomes real about a person the moment you can picture them simply hurting, without the armor of their ideas around them. Just a human being in pain working through it the only way available, which is slowly and without guarantees. And it raised a question, gently, that had been waiting for the right moment to be asked. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person who tells everyone else how to be strong. Jordan Peterson built, in part, his public reputation on ideas about responsibility. About the importance of bearing your burden without surrendering to it. About the relationship between meaning and suffering and how accepting the difficulty of life, rather than running from it, is what allows a person to grow. These ideas connected with people in ways that are difficult to overstate. The letters that reached him, the messages from people whose lives had shifted because of something he said, those were real. The impact was real, but there is a shadow that follows that kind of role. It's quiet and it's persistent. When you become the symbol of standing up under pressure, the one everyone watches to see how it's done, the internal cost of appearing to be what people need you to be becomes its own kind of weight. And admitting that the weight is too heavy becomes almost structurally impossible, because the admission itself seems to contradict the message. Michaela, in speaking about her father's recovery, put a name to something that many people had sensed without being able to articulate. She described how the process of coming back from near collapse had forced him into an encounter with himself that the relentless motion of his public life had been, in some ways, preventing. The lectures, the arguments, the debates, they kept him moving fast enough that certain questions couldn't quite catch up. Being still, being sick, being genuinely unable to perform, stripped all of that away. She talked about her father the way people talk about someone they have sat with in the dark. Not with clinical distance, not with the careful phrasing of someone managing a reputation, with a tenderness that had been earned in rooms the public never saw. According to accounts of her recent conversations, she described a moment during his recovery where he cried in a way she had not witnessed from him before. Not from physical pain and not from fear. From something she described as release. As if something held with enormous tightness for an enormous amount of time had finally, in the fragility of illness and recovery, been allowed to open. No official account has been made of what specifically surrounded that moment. No conclusions have been publicly drawn. But those who have followed him closely noted that something in his public manner shifted in that period. Something became quieter, more measured, less driven by the need to win the argument. Not weaker but differently oriented, pointing somewhere further inward. There is a version of the story of Jordan Peterson that will always live in the cultural arguments. In the debates about what he said and whether he was right and what his influence has meant and what it might still mean. Those conversations are not going away and there are real reasons they continue to matter, but there is another version of the story, the one Michaela carries. In that version, he is not an ideology. He is not a movement or a cautionary tale or a cultural inflection point. He is her father, a man she watched nearly disappear and then slowly come back. A man she has disagreed with publicly at times and remained close to anyway. A man who is, at 63, still standing, but standing differently than he stood at 57 or at 50, or at the moment the world first decided it knew who he was. The relationship between them has drawn its own share of public curiosity over the years. They have appeared together in interviews. They have openly navigated differences in opinion. They have each gone in directions the other might not have chosen. But what has remained consistent through all of it is that the connection is real. Whatever lives at the edges of their relationship, the center of it is solid. In some of her more recent conversations, Michaela reportedly spoke about what she hopes for her father as his life continues to move forward. She did not speak about books. She did not speak about platforms or debates or what his legacy might look like. She spoke about peace. She said simply that she hoped he could find some. That kind of hope is specific. It is not abstract. It comes from having watched someone fight for a very long time and knowing, at a cellular level, what that fighting has cost. It is the hope of someone who loves someone else not as a symbol or a position, but as a person. A real person with a real body and a real history of real pain. Questions about where Peterson goes from here, what he will say, what conversations he will enter, what ideas he will continue to pursue remain genuinely open. They will be discussed as everything about him always has been. The world will continue to have opinions, and many of those opinions will be loudly held. But what Michaela offered in speaking the way she spoke was not another entry in that debate. It was something quieter and more permanent. A glimpse, however brief, of what has been real inside all of the noise. A daughter who was there when her father nearly disappeared, who watched him come back, and who found in that return something she felt was worth telling the world about. Not because it changes who he is publicly, but because it completes the picture in a way nothing else could. We are not very good as a culture at letting people be complicated. Someone enters the public conversation and almost immediately the pressure begins. The pressure to be one thing clearly, to be either right or wrong, either valuable or dangerous, either worthy of celebration or overdue for dismissal. The in-between spaces, the contradictions, the quiet evidence of a human being living an actual life inside all the opinions about them. Those tend to get quietly erased by the sheer volume of people with positions to defend. Jordan Peterson has lived inside that pressure for years. His words have been extracted, replicated, weaponized in arguments he never entered, used to represent things he never claimed to represent. He has been, in the most complete sense of the phrase, made into a symbol, and symbols by their nature cannot be broken open, cannot be ill, cannot cry in a hospital room in a country far from home while their daughter sits nearby afraid. But the man who was doing all of that publicly, continuously, was also doing those things. Because he is not a symbol, he is a person. Michaela gave people a window into that. Not a wide window, not an exposé, not a dramatic revelation designed to reshape how the world sees him. Just a small, honest opening into what it has actually looked like, from the inside, to be the family of Jordan Peterson during the hardest years of his life. She said he changed. That the experience of collapsing and recovering and slowly finding his way back had opened something in him that the forward motion of his public life had kept sealed. That what she found on the other side of all that difficulty was a version of her father she found deeply moving. That is not a political statement. It is not an endorsement or a defense. It is something simpler and harder to categorize. It is a daughter saying that her father went through something enormous and survived it, and that surviving it made him more, not less, of what he was at his core. There is a conversation that rarely gets space in the places where Peterson is usually discussed. The conversation about cost. About what it costs to be the person who says the things he said, to carry the weight of being meaningful to so many people while carrying private weight that was crushing him from the inside. About the relationship between visible strength and invisible suffering, and how those two things can exist inside the same person at the same time without either being false. Michaela opened that conversation gently and without agenda, and it landed in people in a place that arguments about his ideas never quite reached. At 63, with everything behind him and whatever comes next still ahead, the most honest image of Jordan Peterson that the public has been offered may be this one. Not the figure at the lectern. Not the headline, just a man changed by what he survived, seen clearly by the person who never stopped watching. Some things once seen that way are difficult to unsee. And perhaps that is exactly the point. If something in this moved you, take a moment before you move on. Leave a thought in the comments, something this brought up for you, something it made you think about, a question it left behind. Those conversations matter, and we read every one of them. If you believe that some stories deserve to be told slowly, and that the most important things are usually the quietest ones, stay with us. Subscribe and be here for what comes next. There is always more worth saying, and we will always take the time to say it properly.